Warm welcome to our new webinar. Today it's the Young Scholarship Series within the Research Futures webinar series. I'm extremely happy to welcome our young colleague Tony Kirabira, who's going to address a very important topic, the topic of violence against women, gender-based violence during conflicts. Before we start, let me remind you a few facts and figures which are extremely important and yet extremely shocking as well. According to the UN, it is estimated that 35% of women worldwide have experienced either physical and or sexual intimate partner violence or sexual violence by a non-partner in their lives. However, some studies show that up to 70% of women have experienced physical or sexual violence from an intimate partner in their life. Evidence show that women have experienced physical, sexual, intimate partner violence report higher rates of depression, obviously having an abortion or acquiring HIV/AIDS compared to women who have not. And we're talking about everywhere in the world. We're talking about conflicts, we're talking about developing countries, but we're also talking about our countries. You all have seen the rise, I should say maybe the surge of domestic violence during the lockdown here in the UK, while we are in a democratic country with all sorts of tools available for us. It is estimated that nothing less than 87,000 women who were intentionally killed in 2017 globally. Within that, more than half, that's 55%, were killed by intimate partners or family members. So again, we're talking about UN figures. You understood that the question is extremely important, it's severe, it's the time for action. And Tony today is going to address this issue from the perspective of conflicts. Tony is my PhD candidate. He's working currently on a PhD in law, in international law. His research is focused on transnational justice and international criminal prosecution. He's currently based in The Hague because he's interning with the International Criminal Court for his PhD. His research uses a socio-legal analysis. He explores the Rohingya crisis and the accountability nexus in Myanmar. Tony has already a vast work experience. He has worked as a legal officer at Vision Group in Uganda. So his research is quite comparative. He compares Myanmar with Uganda, and he has been involved in international human rights work, including participation in the UN Rights Council in Geneva and a number of other bodies. So I'm extremely happy to welcome Tony for a very important discussion today. So Tony, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Professor Leila. I'm indeed honored to receive that very excellent introduction. I feel humbled indeed. And good afternoon, everybody. I'm just excited to have you to just share my thoughts on this very important topic. And indeed, it's something that really touches a lot of our work, but also a lot of the research in one way or another. Like I've been introduced, I'm from Uganda, and I've grown up in Uganda, and I work there as a lawyer. That's professionally my background. But I'm also involved in research and work still with the journalists, with the media, but also with victims, especially of human rights. So my focus for my doctoral studies is actually focused on gross human rights violations within conflict in Myanmar, the Rohingya. But I'm very, very interested in also sharing my thoughts about gender-based violence, because a lot of the times in our legal research, these issues are not as explored as we would like to. So I just hope to a bit of a comparison between what's going on in Myanmar and in Uganda. And Myanmar, it's not the entire Myanmar per se, but the focus is on the Rohingya, who already are a concern to the world, because it's a crisis that really nobody to address. In Asia as well, in Bangladesh, hugest refugee camp there. But also in Uganda, it interests me not just because I'm Ugandan, but also because of the magnitude of the refugee situation there, which is the largest in Africa. And I feel really very intimate in also trying to seek for solutions, because I work again with some of these people. So briefly about the Rohingya, stateless minority in Myanmar, in Asia. And over the past couple of years, 2 years, 3 years, there's been an escalation of ethnic conflict in the Rakhine State, because Myanmar is majority Buddhist country, and the Muslims are the minority, so there's ethnic tensions, but also violence. And there's been some interesting studies, but also reports, majorly from the United Nations, but also independent human rights organizations, that have documented a host of atrocities. Worse is also the finding of genocide against the Rohingya people, perpetrated by, among others, state agents. So as we talk at the moment, there's also ongoing international investigation by the International Criminal Court, based in Bangladesh. The government of Myanmar itself is, you could say, a transition from a democracy, because they have a very progressive state chancellor. However, there are military excesses, and that's why even the international mechanisms are not well supported by the government in Myanmar. So, you know, like I said, this violence has led to both humanitarian situations, but also we are also interested in the gross human rights violations. Accountability is what we hope for. Legal accountability, but also accountability for other aspects of life. And for the purpose of this brief discussion, we shall focus on refugees, close to 1 million, currently housed in Bangladesh, especially in the context of gender-based violence. Again, for Uganda, massive crisis, but a little bit in context different, because it is not as though there is a conflict in Uganda, but the conflicts in the region, what we call the Great Lakes region. So we have political instability in neighboring South Sudan, in the Congo, also in Burundi, and then across Kenya up to Somalia. The interesting work going on there with the refugees, but it's really massive. So it's not really a problem for one country, it's a regional problem. It's a regional problem. That also complicates matters, because when everybody views that a problem as not entirely their problem, sometimes we have clear limitations on how to address those problems. But I would like to focus on the gender dimensions within the refugee camps, because the the most vulnerable victims and refugees are children and also women. In the picture that you might see on your screen, those are women and girls that have received sanitary materials to use in the camps. So that's another unique vulnerability, and why we stress gender-sensitive approaches towards refugees. And again, you ask yourself, if they're already refugees and they're protected, probably like we should expect, is there a risk of re-victimization? The obvious answer is yes, because we see instances of child labor, of gender-based violence, but also trafficking in these countries. And this has been documented from studies. For example, a refugee in Bangladesh stated that the most significant and common reports of abuse to her included paying for Bangladeshi national papers and also sexual exploitation and abuse. So this quote is my motivational theme for this presentation, because it highlights different problems that are related. For example, the refugees in Rohingya, the Rohingya refugees are currently housed in Bangladesh. So they need some sort of status, which they do not, unfortunately. So, oh, my technology. Thank you. Just to give you a snapshot about gender-based violence from a legal perspective, but I'm also mindful that there are interests from everyone from different disciplines. But the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights has defined it as, of course, it's an expansive definition, so you could see threats of violence, coercion as well. It's really broad. And this leads me to important questions for us, colleagues. In light of our understanding of gender-based violence, how could we tackle these problems? How do we respond? Displaced to forced marriage, how do we respond to that? Sexual attacks, how do we respond to that? And the approach that I'm taking is a social one, because the law does not operate in a vacuum. It operates along with other disciplines and other resources. So the society generally is involved. And so I drew my findings from a host of studies and research from scholars across these disciplines, but also more importantly, rights and humanitarian law, because we know at least there are some concrete legal obligations for states like Uganda, like Bangladesh, like Myanmar. So then this is what we have observed in the camps, in the Rohingya camps, for example. The biggest problem at the moment, honestly, is not gender-based violence, but the bigger picture is the statelessness of the Rohingya themselves. because they're not considered as citizens of Myanmar and they're not considered as citizens of Bangladesh. So where do they report to? Who do they report to and who is responsible? But also traditional adjudication of disputes, because a lot of customary elements, especially within the Islamic traditions, they have some elders that are perceived as adjudicators of dispute. But honestly, they are more of mediators. So you wonder if they're able to adjudicate upon gender-based issues. But also it's alarming that, incredible that over 50% of the girls are already married under 18 years. But also a lot of information is not disseminated well, you know. Of course, language difficulties, but also a cultural problem, because dissemination of information, just like media, needs to be tailored to fit within the audience. Sadly, not many victims actually even perceive their suffering or experiences as gender-based violence. As you already know, the COVID-19 pandemic is creating a lot of mess, not just in our, but imagine people housed in camps and they're not able to move, they're not able to report, they're not able to access information, but they continue to suffer. So then you wonder, okay, is there a progress at the moment? Yes, in the camps, some service facilities, but these are mainly by humanitarian agencies, United Nations agencies, and development partners. Safe space for women and girls. I found this interesting because then women just are able to just hang out together and talk, share a lot of stuff, but also talk openly without feeling victimized. But again, psychosocial support is currently being done in the camp. I've engaged some colleagues working there at the moment with UNICEF, with the UN Developmental Program. And this is amazing. But also there's joint agency coordination in Cox's Bazar. Cox's Bazar is the district in Bangladesh that houses the majority of the refugees. So you could say, is that progress enough? Not, but at least it is something that we can say is a step in the right direction. And then I'll head to the situation in Uganda. According to studies, and for example, Dr. Crow has an interesting field work in Uganda in the camps. And of course, a lot of the challenges are across the spectrum: domestic violence, physical assault. Yeah, but like I said, information is not disseminated or even perceived well, so not many people even realize that they are used. But also in Uganda, there's structural discrimination in that the girls was forced to marry at a young age because of the culture, you know, but also because of the structures, if there are not adequate schools, then there's limited options for interventions. But also the other structural discrimination issue relates to the allocation of resources. Because in Uganda, at least the refugees are allocated some land to be able to cultivate crops and to be able to sustainable life. And they, of course, they work, but to most of the women, when they work and they sell the crops, and then the men will take the proceeds and then maybe go and drink alcohol, you know, so that means the resources are not adequately used, you know, within the homesteads, but also at the administrative level, humanitarian level, the way the camps are structured. Also, according to this, it also fuels gender-based violence. For example, there's no piped water, you know. So imagine if, because traditionally the roles of the women, of course, customary roles to go and fetch water from the well, and usually it is not a close distance. It is maybe a 1 kilometer or 2 kilometer distance. So across the way, then they complain that, of course, they're vulnerable to attacks, rape, and so you could say that is a structural problem. But also, of course, the COVID-19 surge, lockdown, and this is interesting because for the Ugandan case, for example, if the women have been able to sustain their livelihoods through doing some work, going to the streets to try to vend some things, some items, but now they face brutality when they do that, brutality from the leaders, brutality against them, but also experience gender-based violence within the homesteads. There is actually a report of increased cases of sexual abuse. I think maybe because it's not easy to implement at the moment as well, you know. So, any progress? Oh, yes. In contrast to the situation of the Rohingya, the refugees in Uganda are able to enjoy their legal rights, at least, because Uganda has a good legal framework. There is a law, specific law, that accords refugees rights to do a lot of stuff that we do. Education, they go to the same schools that we do. They're able to apply for, say, asylum. They're able to work. And to me, that is even more important. They're able to work. But also, international level, Uganda is a party to the UN Convention on Refugees. There is a convention that gives state parties obligations, how they're able to treat refugees. But Bangladesh is not a party to the important convention. So basically, the legal interventions in Bangladesh are more on a humanitarian level, but there's no clear basis for Bangladesh to say, okay, we've got to protect these refugees because they're not party to that important convention. Yeah, just like in the Rohingya situation, there's a lot of psychosocial support for the victims, which is good. But also as a lawyer, I'm very fascinated by the idea of mobile courts in the refugee settlements. Not all of them. It's mostly in the northern part of the country. But at least statistically, it indicates some good progress because the victims are able to report their cases and they're also able to sit in a court and observe and hear experiences and talk. However, there's a challenge that, because that program was primarily developed as an intervention by the High Commissioner for Human Rights, development partners, and the government of Uganda. But of course, it's not active at the moment because there's no money, there's lack of funding. So that means the victims who have their cases in the courts cannot follow up because they don't have transport, because they have to travel long distances to go to the court. So the state prosecutors, for example, will tell you that we would love to help, but we don't have resources, so we can't travel to the camps, and also the victims are not able to travel. So the cases die out. So then that also leads to some observations, really. Like we said, this underreporting of cases, of course, because a lot of cultural problems, dissemination. Also the risk of disease is serious because remember, in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, there's an alarming rate of HIV, but also the trauma on the family members, and of course the culture and traditional beliefs about gender relations across. That women are perceived to be domestic workers as opposed to people that are able to do the same work, for example. Yeah, and to me, from these observations, I reflect on my own experiences, especially about trauma, because in Uganda, my own mother runs a school, so there was many refugee kids from South Sudan. But it reflects in her form the violence and trauma they've experienced. It reflects in their interactions with their peers. For example, they tend to be violent as well. I have seen this, for example, where we have to intervene. They tend to be extremely violent, most many because of the child soldiers, sort of soldiers in South Sudan. So it's also interesting, but a lot of kids can also use weapons. So it's not something that is really as easy to handle. But at least I'm very encouraged when I see them going through school because I know that that is a good path for them to get out of their victimhood, But for example, then when I think about what happens in the Rohingya, and I will, during the course of my work, of my research, go there actually physically to collect my data. But if people are just living in an environment, no education, stateless, no hope, and the entire world, think, okay, maybe this issue is more important, maybe this is more important. maybe this kind of racism is, maybe this, you know. So I hope this can trigger our minds, to reflect on these issues. So if you would ask me what is the ideal solution, of course I have interesting ideas in mind. I could tell you maybe let's lobby for the Bangladesh government to sign up to the relevant human rights treaties and be able to accord the refugees their legal status. I could say maybe let's join hands with the International Committee for the Red Cross to disseminate information, maybe let's join hands to train. Or as a lawyer, I would also say, no, let's make sure they get to court, they get to the ICC, and they're able to tell their stories. And let's make sure gender-based violence is also among the crimes, because we know it is also a war crime. But at the end of the day, we have these thoughts, but they always don't reflect out in what happens because of politics also, but also other dynamics. So maybe, okay, the law has a role, but in my opinion, it's limited at the moment, especially for gender-based violence. But for broader crimes, of course, genocide, there's another case going on, interesting case, in the International Court of Justice at the moment, involving genocide. The state of Gambia filed this case in Myanmar, alleging genocide. It's currently very at the preliminary stages, but at least the court asked the government of Myanmar to respect the Rohingyas and not to condone any other persecution or atrocities against them. The government expressly denied having anything to do with the Rohingya suffering. Interesting. And in conclusion, so this discussion is also part of that I've written in a book chapter that is forthcoming, and I'll be glad to share when it is finally published. Otherwise, thank you so much for listening to me, and I hope you have maybe some concerns or some experiences or some questions, because I know we have a broad a broad range of participants. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Tony. That was excellent. It's a very important discussion, as you all understood. I'm also very grateful that you brought some of your personal experience in the discussion, because obviously, as you said, you've worked in Uganda on similar cases and you've experienced certain situations firsthand, as you said in your presentation. It was particularly interesting to understand the role of statelessness and the difference it brings when these victims are not stateless, and indeed it's something really important in the Rohingya discussion. You also clearly highlighted the possibility of re-victimization, and this is certainly something we are going to discuss now, in particular within the COVID-19 crisis. I've seen a number of questions related to that, how victims are re-victimized or potentially re-victimized. I had a first question for you, and I've seen that someone else has asked it as well. It's about the mobile court, and I see that Emma has asked this question. It's something which is well known of lawyers, mobile courts. We've seen them after the Rwanda genocide, for instance, in Rwanda and different countries in Africa. We've also seen them in big developing countries like China. It's basically about access to justice. So the question of Emma is the following. I'm starting with you, Emma, and then I'll read out all the questions we've received. Emma asks, I'm really interested in the idea of mobile courts. What is the conviction rate for the accused when a victim who do come forward? Do victims who come forward have positive outcomes, or do they suffer further in that cultural and political environment? Indeed, access to justice, transitional justice, and yet a number of really problematic questions when we talk about mobile court, the quality of justice, and how justice is delivered. What do you think, Tony?
Thank you so much, Emma, for that question. Victim perspective about the mobile courts, I would say I do not have any statistic information about the convictions, mostly because, especially in Uganda, like most developing countries, these cases take years. Could take close to 3 years to get concluded. So it's really hard to follow up. But however, from a transitional justice perspective, the victims at least are able to tell their stories, to share, and to me, I believe that is also good relief for them. Just the fact that they're able to tell their story and to have some audience.
Mm. That's right, Tony. It's again access to justice, and we often use a number of categories in law: retributive justice, restorative justice. So it indeed enables victims to have access to justice and perceive that their case has been heard, right? But what sort of hurdles do you see about mobile justice?
Mobile justice is, first of all, largely dependent on funding, special funding, because it is not really, most times it is not structured within the country's legal framework, because the legal framework only specifies for court stations. So that means that it is good, but when there's no funding, so you cannot have court sessions. And also, on average, there are 3 sessions in a year. So you would imagine, and when there are 3 sessions in a year, one session would have a lot of cases. And there's also re-victimization as well, because if the victims are known by the perpetrators within the society, then there's also potential fear.
Yeah.
But also, some of them, sometimes we have traditional justice system, like sometimes in northern Uganda, but it's mainly about mediation and about reconciliation. So it's not anything punitive, really.
I understand, Tony, and that was really important what you said about the fact that justice coming to you can be good, but it can be also problematic when you are too close to the perpetrators. So that's one of the criticism, element of criticism we often hear. And there is much more to say about traditional justice and a number of initiatives. But I see that we have quite a bit of questions. So let me read another question for you. The first question was from Sumia. I have studied about the Rohingya crisis. Oh, sorry, the questions move. I have studied about the Rohingya crisis. I think she was saying during my international relations class, how the COVID-19 would affect the lives of refugees around the world, signatories and non-signatory members of states of the 1951 Convention, what legal dispositions and policies can be undertaken for the same. And we had another question actually from Holly, which was related. What's the impact of COVID-19 on the region?
Thank you. Like you have clearly stated, I think, Sumaya, that there's legal obligations at least that arise because of treaties. For example, the treaty and UN Convention on Status of Refugees, 1951. And that in itself, if a country is signatory, like Uganda and many other countries, the country is still obliged to fulfill their obligations, even where there is a crisis. So for this case, even when there's COVID-19 crisis, we still expect that the states fulfill their legal obligations, that they still respect human rights. But however, of course, there's restraint, and because of COVID-19, the states are now, of course, trying to prioritize some of their resources towards maybe public health. So that's the impact, that now the privatization of approaches is more towards the health and personal safety, and we see less budgeting and attention towards fundamental human rights, but also gender-based violence.
Mm-hmm. Thanks very much, Jenny. We have a few more questions. One which is really interesting, and I don't know whether you have an answer to that. From Mamu Pandare, sorry if I don't pronounce your name well. Do we have cases of women who are non-Rohingyas also edging their males to rape or commit some gender-based violence forms to the Rohingyas? So I suppose the question relates to, gender-based violence, if not rape, as a weapon, in fact, in conflicts, and not necessarily in conflicts, but I suppose that here we can say it's a conflict.
That's an excellent question. That's an excellent question, and it is also an issue that we need to address a lot as researchers. Actually, there are reported cases where women have perpetrated gender-based violence. But however, the problem sometimes is a lot of the studies, especially in psychology, indicate that the men are not as willing to report sometimes, and so that victimhood is problematic. But it's a problem. But also, we also observe that, for example, in the Rwanda genocide, there were women that actually were working with perpetrators, not just actually cheering and observing and condoning acts of gender-based violence. So yeah, that's true, and that's something we cannot underlook in the context.
Absolutely, Tony. This person was also observing that this is something we've seen greatly in the context of the Rwanda genocide, but many other genocides actually. Can you explain from a legal perspective why is rape considered in a number of decisions actually now as a weapon?
Thank you. Rape is considered as a weapon because it also goes just beyond the act itself, but it goes also to the dignity of the person. It affects the dignity of the person. If I have worked with some victims, and it's not just the acts that they feel bad about, but they feel broken. They feel totally embarrassed. The men, for example, they'll feel, okay, they're not men anymore. And yet this is a recurrent practice. It was observed also in the Bosnian genocide. It was observed in, we had a case at the ICC of Bemba, Jean-Pierre Bemba, former Congolese vice president, and also in the northern Uganda context, but also in the Rohingya. It is a weapon of war. So it is a crime because it goes against the humanity of the victim.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you very much for having used two very important words, the dignity and the humanity. This is exactly what we're trying to deal with when we talk about gender-based violence in conflict or non-conflict moment, actually. So in producing gender-based violence, you're basically taking off the human dignity of the person and, in fact, his or her humanity. So we have a question which relates to the consequences of all this from Holly. She was asking, do you think there is any chance or any chance that cases regarding the Rohingya will eventually be heard in the International Criminal Court? So again, Tony is interning at the moment at the International Criminal Court, so you might have heard about a number of discussions. What do you think?
That's interesting, and I need to give a disclaimer that I'm not able to speak for the court, obviously because of my professional duty. But there is an investigation going on because the court actually allowed the prosecutor of the ICC to start an investigation in Myanmar stroke Bangladesh. So the investigation is not just focused, it's not actually focused on what transpired in Myanmar, because Myanmar is not a state party to the Rome Statute. The Rome Statute is the law that governs the ICC. So Myanmar is not a state party, so it's not as easy to prosecute the officials. But however, there's what we call cross-border, especially deportation, crime of deportation. So yeah, there's an investigation going on, but of course it involves a lot of important legal questions that we might need to ask, But yeah, we were hopeful. Nonetheless, we're hopeful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and again, this is very official. And Tony, thanks for saying that. It was a sort of disclaimer because obviously you can't talk directly about a number of things. However, everything official is available on the website of the International Criminal Court. So everyone, if you're interested, there is more to see there. We have a few other questions, but can I ask you again about the concept of statelessness? Because I don't know if everybody's very familiar with that. Can you explain again why a country or people rather who are stateless have greater difficulty and maybe in using a number of comparison in general international law?
Thank you. Statelessness is a huge legal barrier towards victims. First of all, like the word itself suggests, statelessness is they're not considered as citizens of any country. And for the Rohingya, it was because of the change in the citizenship law in the 1980s that actually removed them from the list of the people or group that is acknowledged as citizens. So statelessness means that you're not able to access legal remedies from the country. It also means you don't have a passport. That means a lot. You're not registered. You're not able to, enjoy the benefits. So within this context of gender-based violence, some people don't, they simply cannot report because no country is under obligation to take care of the problems.
Absolutely. There's a very basic thing in international human rights law, the state is the one who protects. So if stateless, you're unable to enjoy the protection of the state for human rights, actually. So indeed, this is extremely important in the Rohingya discussion. We have a few more questions and really interesting questions, Tony. So let me find that for you. A question from Fiza. You mentioned cross-border investigation. How forthcoming does Myanmar have to be in order to ensure a successful investigation?
Oh, Visa, that's an interesting one. Of course, it's an issue that is also subject to debate in the legal in the legal field. So, like I said, according to the court, what the court based on to give the ICC a go-ahead to investigate was that some of the crimes were for example, recurring deportation, you know. But to be honest, that's something that we're eagerly looking out for in the next couple of months.
And a related question, thank you very much, Tony. And a related question from Julianne. What are some of the limitations of the International Criminal Court that may hinder justice?
Okay, yeah.
Question.
Okay, to speak from a general perspective, the International Criminal Court is an independent court. It is not owned by any state or anybody. But however, it depends on the support of all the countries, state parties. So it's funded by state parties, and they decide, if they want to go ahead, not with investigations because the court is independent, but a lot of programs, for example, for victims, the International Criminal Court has a very good program for victims, able to give them some funding, some support, like in Uganda, that has been done. So the limitations, maybe in my opinion, could be from the states if they're not able to fund, but also because Myanmar is not a state party, so Myanmar is not cooperating at all with the court, and that's outrageous because you need, like you need the cooperation to investigate. You need the cooperation.
Absolutely, Tony. I think, I don't know whether our audience knows about that, but it's an international tribunal. So the first thing is that you have to be a party to the convention establishing the tribunal, and a number of countries in the world are not, including very big countries. Actually, you'd be surprised to see who's a party, who's not a party. So a big country like the United States is not a party, you see. So this is the main issue to start with, as Tony was pointing out. Tony, we have a few more questions. In particular, a question again from Mamu Pandare. Gender-based violence is considered as a public health issue as well. So I heard you saying that due to COVID-19, issues such as gender-based violence are not being considered as a priority by governments. So do you think the talk on gender-based violence is, as a public health issue, is just lip service actually and not necessarily taken care of?
Well, I would say from a perspective of public health, the experts, of course, the ones that work with the refugees, really determine how they're able to work. So I wouldn't say it is lip service, but like I said, the immediate, right now, the immediate measure is to safeguard refugees from contracting the virus. That's the immediate measure at the moment.
Yes, of course, of course. Well, Tony, I have to thank you. I think that was the last question because we're coming to a close. That was really very interesting. Tony mentioned a chapter he's about to publish in an edited book by Routledge. So feel free to reach out to Tony. You see his email address at the bottom of the presentation. He's certainly someone very knowledgeable on the issue, full of resources. He's published a number of blog posts recently. A few articles are also upcoming in the press, in the news, so you'll see more from Tony. Thank you so much again, Tony. That was really very interesting and important discussion. Everyone, I'd like to say that next week we'll also have a very important discussion by Professor Anthony Bogus, who's the director of the Center for Study of Slavery and Justice at Brown University in the US. So next week we are going to address the question of identity and Black lives, to sum up, because it's quite complex. I invite all of you to join again. It's going to be really interesting. Professor Bogus is one of the important scholars in the field, so we are going to have a really interesting discussion on concepts as well beyond, you know, the reality of what's going on today in the Black Lives Matter movement. We'll go deeper into some theoretical issues and concepts. So join me again next week. I think, you know, my name is Leila Shukran. I'm Professor of International Law and Director of the University of Portsmouth Thematic Initiative for Democratic Citizenship. I'd like to thank the team as well.